Well, hello, FreeThinking Ministries. It is Josh Klein. I am your host here. We're going to have a fun conversation today about Marxism with my friend Tim. I'm going to bring him on stage. He's the executive director of FreeThinking Ministries. Hi, Tim. How are you?
Doing great, Josh.
All right. And then we've got a special guest with us. It is Dr. Tim Stratton, by the way. And then Dr. Owen Anderson. We'll add him to the stage here as well. Thank you for joining us today, Owen.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Well, thanks for being here, Owen. It's been so awesome to get to know you over the last couple of years. I did a Maven trip in Arizona. I think it's a couple years ago now, maybe a little over that.
Yep.
And you reached out to me, so I was going to be down there. We went to Buffalo Wild Wings, and I remember I spilled ranch all over me. I don't know if you remember.
You have to at Buffalo Wild Wings.
Yeah, it's great. But really got to appreciate you, and since then you've kind of skyrocketed into some fame a little bit. I know you wouldn't call it that, but you're getting, I'll just say you're getting a lot of attention. You're making some big waves down there in Arizona, even though you don't have a beachfront down there, but you're still making waves. Right. So thanks for everything you're doing.
Yeah. So
no problem at all. And I'd like to just tell the audience real quick, if you go to my Substack, you'll kind of be updated on what Tim is talking about. I know we'll get into it here as well, but my Substack is Dr. Owen Anderson, and you'll see what's going on at Arizona State University.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Yeah, we'll put that in the description. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Anderson is a professor of philosophy and religious studies at Arizona State University. He's taught there for 24 years. He's also a faculty associate at Phoenix Seminary, where he teaches philosophical theology. So he knows what he's talking about in regards to philosophy and the things we're going to be discussed today. And his recent works that we discussed here on Substack, and there's a few articles on, I think it's Clear Truth Media, exposing anti-Christian bias in state universities, and specifically mere Marxism, which is one of our topics here today, right?
Yeah. Now, I got to say, before we get into mere Marxism, tell us a little bit about your jiu-jitsu background, because that's one thing where you and I, where we really connected, because I've done jiu-jitsu and mixed martial arts, and you train in the Gracie system, which I consider to be the top of the line. So, give us a quick update about what you're doing there.
Yeah, I wore the shirt on purpose so we could connect on that, because I think there's a ton of good analogies from jiu-jitsu to the kinds of cultural conflicts we're going through. So I work in the Gracie system under Henner and Huron Gracie, and they're out of Torrance, but I'm an instructor here in Phoenix, Arizona at a Gracie gym. And I've been doing it for 5 years. I've had my kids in it. My wife's gone to their program. It's really just a great opportunity to learn about self-defense, but also learn about a lot of life skills, like being comfortable when you're uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And a lot of people panic as soon as they're on the bottom of side mount.
That's right.
You got to learn now. You can take care of yourself. You'll be all right. So what the Gracies did was they put together a combatives program, it's called, which studied the main things that people do in a street fight.
Mm-hmm.
And they used to have a thing called Gracie Challenge, where anybody who wanted to could come into Henner's father's gym and challenge them. And they recorded these back on the day on VHS tapes, so it's really grainy, but you can see some of them on YouTube. Yeah. And just from doing that kind of thing, being familiar with street fights, they just put together, these are the main things that would happen to you if you're assaulted, and here's how to use jiu-jitsu. So it's a really good beginner's program. After that, you get into the normal sport of jiu-jitsu stuff, but the beginner's program is really good, really fun. And we had a stabbing at my campus last week.
Oh, really?
So one student stabbed another student. There's not a lot of details about it yet, but I immediately emailed my dean and said, hey, we should do a self-defense program for students and faculty. And that got forwarded to somebody, which it got forwarded to somebody else, and looks like it's just going to disappear in email space, right? But I said that this is the perfect program for people to learn. And what more do you want if you're worried about campus safety,
right,
than offering some kind of self-defense program? And basically, I guess the answer is no.
Ah, that's too bad. Well, regarding jujitsu, one thing that's, I've applied that to even philosophical, theological discussions. And, Josh probably gets sick and tired of me talking about this. I know my wife does. But every time there's a conflict, I say, well, it all comes down to justification and defeaters. And if there's a defeater to that defeater. And, like with jujitsu, you always have to think like 3 or 4 moves ahead. And so you'll provide a justification. You'll try to put me in an arm bar, and I know, okay, well, I've got a defeater to this. Let's see if I can apply it. If I can't get out of it, then you tap me out and you win, right? But if I have a defeater to your defeater, now it's your job to say, oh, well, I can counter your defeater with another defeater, and it just goes back and forth until there's a winner, right? And we see what worked and what didn't. And that's just how I apply these conversations when it comes to Marxism or anything else. Any other theological topic. For me, I actually have fun with it. I don't think you said, hey, you're in these tough situations. You got side mount on me. A lot of people freak out. I'm to the point now where I'm like, oh, okay, cool. These guys got full mount on me. And I think I can get out of this. Let me see if it's exactly right. Yep. Right. And so I'm not freaking out. I'm just going, hey, next step. Here's the defeater. And it just works like that. And so I've applied all my training in jiu-jitsu and martial arts in general to these, I think many people see them as very intense kinds of discussions that you're just not supposed to have. You always say you don't talk about religion and politics. And I say, no, those are the first 2 things we should talk about. And we should have fun doing it. We should have fun engaging. Fun engaging each other if we care about truth. And I'll tell you what, the best things for me in my martial arts career was when I lost.
Well, I was about to bring that up.
I would go look at, okay, this is how I lost. I'm never going to let that happen again. And I would make that weakness a strength. And so, Sean McDowell once told me when I started my apologetics and theology training, he said, Tim, never get stumped by the same question twice. So I took that to be the same kind of a mindset thing. That's just how I operate. I think it rubs some people the wrong way, but that's just how it is. What do you think about that?
Well, I think sorry.
Go ahead.
Are you good?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that you're 100% right. I think that Jocko said that this is why jiu-jitsu is particularly good, is because young guys come into a gym and they think, I'm going to tap everybody. Right. And they get tapped immediately. It's very humbling.
Yeah.
And so it's a good process to be tapped, 10,000 times in your jiu-jitsu career, because you realize, okay, I'm not as good as I thought I was. I got to learn. And that's, like you just said, that's the best part of it, is learning and thinking back on those times. And it's also really good when you're sparring, just to say, I'm going to put myself in the worst position I can. How close can I get to a tap and not get tapped and turn the situation around? And sometimes you can't. Sometimes you got too close to the edge, you get tapped. But sometimes you get really close, but you still turn around. And that teaches the lesson you just mentioned, which is you can take care of yourself. You can learn what to do. And I think that it's a helpful lesson about conflict, because I think Christians today, if I don't have an actual empirical study to back this up, but it's just anecdotal, they're conflict avoidant.
Right.
And they think that conflict itself is bad, rather than there's certain ways of conducting yourself that are bad. But conflict is necessary in the culture we live in today because of the anti-Christian attacks that are coming at us.
That's right.
And you can't just say, hey, pal, let's all calm down now. Let's just take a breather. They're attacking you. And so you got to learn, how do I defend Christianity?
Yeah.
No, that's so good. I think a lot of times people go, we don't want to talk about these things because, what we got to make the gospel palatable to people. And I don't see the Bible verse where that occurs, where it says, make sure you soften the blow of the gospel.
Brood of vipers, hypocrites is not palatable.
No,
right.
No. And get behind me, Satan, to his closest follower. Not palatable either, but it is he's drilling down on what people need to hear. And for so long, like Tim said, we've had the don't talk about politics and religion. And then people go, well, why did our culture get the way it is? Well, it's because we have a generation of people that were convinced to not talk about politics and religion. In fact, just before we got on here, and then we'll get to the meat of what we're going to talk about here. Just before we got on here, I don't know who this is. Brian Zand on Twitter has this a GIF or GIF, however you say it, of the Lord of the Rings and Smeagol before he's clutching the ring. He says, "Christian faith yearning for political power is reaching for the one ring."
Yeah.
And so I responded by saying, I see this often, and I get it to a certain extent. You don't just reach for power to reach for power. But more often than not, this trope is used to guilt conservative believers into thinking that participation in politics is unchristian because it's, quote unquote, grasping for power.
Yeah.
But the left and progressives will reach for that power without so much as a peep from the same people. It's more often than not just manipulation. And I think that speaks to how we've really kind of gotten where we are as a society.
Yeah.
Well, that's usually what you'll see is they'll punch right in terms of correcting someone a Christian brother on the right and not on the left. I have an article in American Reformer. I don't have the exact date. I think it was in July. It was responding to Carl Truman on this exact point, where he was sort of criticizing Christians in America, evangelicals, for going after power and being Nietzschean. And I responded and said, well, just like you did. I mean, yeah, of course that would be a problem, but that's not what's actually happening here. You do have laws that reflect your worldview, and no one argues about using the 10 commandments in national law when the commandment is don't murder. We all agree we're using a biblical commandment. So that's not even just debated anymore. So the idea that if you want the Bible to influence culture, you're a Christian nationalist, that's just an ad hominem way to avoid the actual conversation, because people on both sides of the debate already use the 10 commandments in national law.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's get into it. You've written a few articles on Marxism. Tim and I are currently in the midst of crafting what has amounted to a tome instead of just an article on the current political issue. But as we've had these conversations, we've had people say to us, because we've talked about the material dialectic, the oppressor framework that seems to have taken hold of and completely saturated the Democrat Party specifically. And they'll say things like, you just don't get Marxism. All Marxism is that the state seizes the means of production, and it's just the abolishment of class. Nothing about equity or equality of outcome, like you say that is. Those aren't so, and it's not just about some socialist policies. How do we respond to those sorts of things? Because those objections are almost right. Right? Like they're teetering on right when we're talking about classical Marxism. Have you heard those similar objections, and how do we talk about it?
Yeah, 100%. Because if you say that, for example, ASU humanities professors are largely Marxist, many of them will say, no, we're not. This is not the 1950s. Update yourself. There are a couple professors that say, I'm a Marxist, and they walk around in kind of Marxist outfits. But most of them would say, no, we're not. But then they would teach things that are straight out of the Communist Manifesto, particularly that all of history is divided into oppressor and oppressed, and we need some kind of strong centralized government to make that right. So when I think of Marxism, I'm not just using an insult. I'm not just putting someone down and saying, oh, you're just a Marxist. I'm identifying a philosophical school with certain beliefs about the nature of reality and how history works, about human nature. And it's gone through some stages. So you mentioned classical Marxism, and there's neo-Marxism, there's feminist Marxism, there's queer Marxism, cultural Marxism. But the reason they all are called Marxism is what they have in common.
Right.
And that's what I'm getting back to and saying right now at ASU, I'm involved in two conflicts. One is actually going to court. I'm represented by the Goldwater Institute.
Wow.
And we're suing ASU because ASU had required employee training over DEI. And DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And those sound like good words, especially inclusion. So when you oppose DEI, people will come back at you with insults and say, "Oh, so you just want white men to go to
Yeah.
university?" Instead of saying, "No, that's not the issue. The content is the issue." And the Goldwater Institute published all the content that I would be forced to watch, and it's all about the evil of whiteness and about the problem of heteronormativity. And so those both engage in race blame or blaming people based on their religious views of gender, and those violate state law.
Yeah.
So we're going to have our oral arguments before the judge on October 18th to see what happens at the first level of the court, because there's going to be appeal. Both sides will appeal it if they don't get their outcome. So it may go as high as the Arizona Supreme Court. We'll have to wait and see, because it's about an Arizona law. So that's one example where they, I think it's a classical wolf in sheep's clothing scenario. They'll come in and say, "Yeah, we just want to include everybody." I agree 100%. A state university has to include everybody. It's
Right.
Every taxpayer is supporting the state university. But then they switch that out to, well, now let's talk about whiteness. And you say, whoa, how do we get here?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of the power of some of the Marxist framework as far as how they march through the institutions, is the kind of co-opting and redefinition of terms, right? So you look at to anything from truth to racist. You know, the term used to be, dislike or othering. That's another academic term of people based solely on their skin color. It had nothing to do with who had hegemonic power or who had power or what have you. But now racism is only the people who have hegemonic power, people like you and me and Tim who are white. We are the only ones that can be racist. So when you talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, is it safe to say that generally speaking, those sound good because we have a definition that we remember from decades ago, but these are now redefined words?
I think that's definition from even 5 years ago. At least how most people were operating. But sorry, I interrupted, Owen. Go ahead. And
no, you're 100% right. I think that's true. And I think the older model that we all heard Bono singing about in the 90s is colorblindness. And that's now also a kind of racism. You can't do that. So one of the videos that they wanted employees to watch at ASU was titled "How to Explain White Privilege to a Broke White Person." In other words, you don't have to be a Wall Street billionaire ruling the economic empire to be the guy who's in charge of society. You could be a poor white guy, but because you're white, you're having all these privileges. So it's an a priori philosophy, meaning it's not based on empirical research. It's based on how they think about the world. And most of the time, when you look into it, when you read, for example, Ibram X. Kendi, his proofs are anecdotal stories about his own upbringing. And of course, those don't really prove anything. There's other ways to interpret what happened to him. But he'll say, yeah, when I was this age, someone was mean to me, and that's because of structural racism. And, well, okay, I'm sorry that happened to you, but that doesn't really prove your conclusion.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of proof you'll see, because what's important for them is just that they feel this very strongly. And so it doesn't matter what arguments you give back about that, because you're not dealing with arguments. You're dealing with, I feel very strongly about this, and you're trying to disprove it, which reconfirms in my mind exactly the point I'm making, which is you white guys don't listen to us.
Let me touch on a couple things you said earlier. You noted that when you refer to one of your colleagues at the university as a Marxist, that they often would take that as maybe your name calling. In fact, just today, Josh and I were involved in an email where somebody accused me of being a name caller because I had said that I thought he was a Marxist sympathizer. He's another professor at another university, and he took offense to that. But then I went through, and Josh and I have talked to him in the past. We've gone through the receipts, as it were, to show why we have reached this conclusion. And he's been invited to be public and denounce Marxism and explain to everybody why Marxism is bad, but won't do that, which adds more justification to why I think he's a Marxist sympathizer. But it's like me saying, hey, I am not, if somebody said, Tim, you're a Christian. And I said, oh no, I am not a Christian. Do not call me a Christian. I do believe in the one triune God who exists necessarily. I believe that Jesus is the second person of the Trinity, and I have a personal love relationship with him. He's provided the means of salvation, and I've dedicated my life to following the law of Christ. But do not name call me and label me as a Christian. Yeah. Well, of course I'm a Christian, right? Because that's what it means to be a Christian. And when you see these professors out there today saying, "Do not call me a Marxist," but then they check all the boxes of what it means to be a Marxist. Well, then you're a Marxist. If the shoe fits, then wear it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think that's 100% right. And let me give an example from the other side. A couple of years ago, ASU, there was an event at ASU. It wasn't sponsored by ASU. It was brought in by TPUSA. And Charlie Kirk and Dennis Prager and Robert Kiyosaki were going to speak. And I don't know what the percentage, 80% of the honors college professors at ASU wrote a letter, signed it, about how those three are white nationalists. And so if you know about, you might say, okay, maybe Charlie Kirk, he's not, but okay. Dennis Prager is, of course, outspoken Jewish guy who writes commentaries on the Bible. And Robert Kiyosaki is Japanese American. And so that's an example of an insult, because white nationalism is something that generally people agree is not a good thing. And if you link your opponent to it, you might have a case to keep them off of the secular university, because you might connect them to inciting violence, and you can't come to secular university and incite violence. You can speak about your ideas, but you can't do that. So it's an attempt to censor.
Yeah.
But that's not the same as Marxism as a label, because I'm not saying Marxism to keep anyone off campus. I'm just saying what you just said, and well, you believe all of these things. Now, a closer category might be Christian nationalists, and that one gets thrown around too, and that's very different. Although I should say, in secular professors' minds, those are the same thing.
Yeah,
Christian nationalists and white nationalists. But Christian nationalists is a very broad topic that includes a lot of different views, and so someone might try to make that case about Charlie Kirk, but not the white nationalist case. That's just an insult. So they might say, you're just doing what we do, but no, those are very different. And I do think it gets closer to the real problem, because although they start out with white men, when you look into what they're worried about, it's not just the random white man. They're not worried about, for example, Richard Dawkins. They're worried about Christians. And it gets specifically to attacks on Christianity. And that is their worry. And so what they do is, to use their term, they problematize all of Christian history by saying, especially the last 500 years, Christians are just colonial slaveholders. And that's all they've done. They made a bunch of Europeans rich, and they took resources from everyone else. And it's time that we set that right.
Yeah, they're colonizers. They have colonized. I mean, that's the what do I say? That's the term du jour on college campuses, right?
We have whole programs on decolonizing. That's a third conflict I got into. That's kind of gone away because they had to back off of requiring it, and just say you can study decolonizing. But we still have entire programs dedicated to studying how to decolonize.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. And that decolonization really is destruction, right? I mean, that's, how do you decolonize? How would you decolonize the United States? Well, you would have to get rid of all of the people you feel like are actually colonizing. And another term that's been redefined, what does it mean to colonize, has been redefined to only suit that oppressor framework.
Yeah. What you do is you redistribute capital. What does that sound like?
Yeah. Marxism.
Yeah.
And it's for perceived past wrongs. So it's not because, for example, Tim was doing these things, but it might be the case that Tim's great-great-grandfather did them. Now, what's hilarious is when it turns out like Tim will go through a genetic test, and it will turn out, no, he actually didn't have anybody that did that.
Yeah.
But then you'll see someone like Kamala Harris do it, and it'll be as close as like her grandfather had slaves.
Wow.
Right. So again, it's all based on just looking at people and assessing them based on their skin color, when the reality is sometimes flipped.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll share the story real quick, and then I remember having actually in high school this conversation when I was in high school. We're talking about reparations, and somebody said, all white people should. So this is not new. This is something that's been going on for years. But somebody said to me specifically, yeah, all white people, including you, should give reparations. To which I responded and said, okay, so for a fact that my ancestors owned slaves in the United States, right? And they say, yeah. And I said, what if I told you I'm a second generation American and my grandparents came over from Germany in the 1940s? Like, oops. Yeah.
Well, I don't even think that was to be an oops though for the professors I work with, because they would say, nevertheless, your grandfather and father and you have been given benefits from white supremacy that you wouldn't have gotten if you weren't white. So that won't even stop them.
Yep. Because we're part of that, the hegemonic power, or the white majority. So maybe, go ahead, Tim. You were going to share.
I was just going to say that, with the traditional definition of racism in mind, these DEI folks are racists. I mean, they seem to be opposed to the, at least the famous teachings of Martin Luther King, where he said, hey, don't judge people based on their skin, judge them by their character. Well, it's reversed now. Now they are not judging us by our character. They're judging us by the basis of the amount of melanin in our skin. And like you said, Kamala Harris's grandparents, is that right? Her grandparents owned slaves?
I don't know if it's grandparents or great-grandparents, but it's definitely the case that she's much closer to slavery than, for example, I am.
Yeah, me too. And so, but since she's got more melanin in her skin than I do, then she's given a pass and I'm not. And that just, you're judging me by the basis of my skin, which is exactly opposed to what Martin Luther King advocated.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And there's other things that he said that they would quote that seem to support the idea of reparations.
Yeah. But what made Martin Luther King,
read,
I was just gonna say that what made Martin Luther King famous is what I'm referencing here. No,
that's right. Yeah. And even the ones that I've read, when they do quote that, they're from sermons he gave. And I don't think he's talking about economic. I think he's appealing to God to right wrongs and pay back spiritually.
Yeah.
So we'd have to look at the specific details, but the Marxists won't catch that because they're not thinking spiritually. They're thinking only materially. And that's another feature of Marxism, is it waters all of life down to the economic. Let's say hypothetically, they're 100% right. You don't have any privilege unless you're white, and you'll have a very difficult life economically. That still doesn't keep you from getting the most important things in life. Economics doesn't represent our most important things. In fact, it might be the reverse. It's very often the case that people who are economically poor are nevertheless able to know and love God in a way that the rich never, ever will, because they're prideful. Think about Jeff Bezos cruising around on a yacht that's so big, it has another yacht inside of it. So that if he ever decides he wants to go yachting while he's out yachting, he opens a compartment and another yacht comes out and he can go yachting.
Wow.
He's not spending his days learning to love God.
No.
We just saw P. Diddy get arrested for unspeakable crimes.
Yeah.
Super wealthy. All the people who are connected to him are terrified right now that he might get named. What are they doing with their time and money? So this idea that the rich have a better life than the poor is simply false, but it's what's perpetuated by Marxism.
That's good. So, in light of that, let's for those of you who are with us so far, we keep using the term Marxism. You wrote an article on mere Marxism. Would you break that down just kind of quickly for us? What do you speak of when you speak of mere Marxism?
Yeah, of course. Obviously, I got the title and the idea from Lewis's Mere Christianity.
Oh, come
And
on. You got the title from Mere Molinism.
that's right. Lewis
No.
is the grandfather. I got it from Tim, and then he got it from Lewis. But yes, the idea of let's just give a straightforward definition of Marxism to avoid the objections that you mentioned earlier, Josh, where people say I'm not that. And so I just go over how Marxism is a religion. It meets all the definitions of a religion, and I think you can make a good case that Marx has been the most successful Christian cult leader in history.
Wow.
It's not just a religion, it's a Christian cult, meaning that it borrows the ideas that are central to Christianity and renames them or gives them new meaning. So, for example, it relies on Rousseau, who's before Marx, but Rousseau said the fall of man, hypothetically, he doesn't believe there was a specific historical moment, but the fall occurred when private property was introduced. And that's what causes people to sin, is private property. So if you go back to a time before private property, that's a perfect society. And that's the mindset you get from a lot of humanities professors, is that what they refer to now as indigenous peoples before colonization were in a pristine state. And we need to go back and look at how they lived, because once colonization occurred and private property was introduced, that's when turmoil begins. So that's Rousseau to Marx. And then Marx explains how to be redeemed from that. And it's through this revolution and upending all of society that you can then make a perfect human and redeem yourself from the fall of man. So it uses all these same ideas, and it's influenced the globe now for 150 years, including 100 million murders, mostly of Christians who opposed Marxism.
Yeah. And that's on the low end, isn't it? 100 million?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah.
Because we don't have numbers because they were just disappeared.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting to say that Karl Marx is a Christian cult leader, because if you look at Karl Marx, he doesn't have a very soft spot for Christianity in general, right? Like he is not pro-religion, pro-Christian.
Well, no cult leader would be, right? I mean, if they like Christianity, they'd stay in an Orthodox small O church. So any cult leader thinks those guys don't know what they're talking about. I've got some new, fresh ideas. But you're right. I mean, and there's even been work done to see from his personal journals where he praised Lucifer. So generally, Marxists will praise Lucifer not because they think there's a being called Lucifer, but because he's an example of rebelling against the Christian God.
Yeah, that's the Lucifer was actually kind. He brought knowledge to the human beings instead of keeping it from them. So he was the light bringer. That's where
Marxism connects up with really, really ancient anti-God teaching, because that's essentially the story you'll find in each of the polytheistic stories, is somebody like Prometheus, who's Lucifer, brought humans enlightenment, fire, and was punished by the ruling God. And you'll see that story multiplied over and over. Basically, it's Genesis chapter 3, but with the serpent cast as the good guy and Yahweh as the bad guy.
Yeah, and they will often misquote the Milton Paradise Lost. They'll say it's better to reign in hell than serve in heaven, but that's actually Satan coping. It's actually just a big cope, and it's interesting.
He doesn't want to be there. He immediately tries to figure out how to leave.
Yeah. There were a few quotes that I have saved from Marx as far as religion goes. There's one. It's not from Marx, but it's from somebody that knew, I believe, Frederick Engels. Edward, I don't know how to say his last name. Aveling said he held Marx that Christian socialism was a contradiction in terms, that Marx held that. Why do you think so many people on that profess faith have actually bought something that even Karl Marx says was a contradiction?
Yeah, that's another piece I look at in that article, is how Marxists have, I was going to say duped Christians, but how they've infiltrated Christianity very purposefully in the United States, compared to, say, Russia, where the Soviets just shut down and opposed the Eastern Church. In the United States, the strategy had to be different because they knew they couldn't do that kind of full frontal assault. And so what they had to do instead was infiltrate the ideology of Christians by using the Bible against them. And so they first blurred very simple categories that are different. State and church are different institutions. They have different purposes. The state protects its boundaries and it enforces law. This is stated very well in the opening of the Constitution. That's what the state does. The church teaches the gospel. It doesn't have any borders. It teaches the gospel to everybody. It doesn't protect borders in that way. It protects orthodoxy, but not geographical borders. And so the first thing was to blur the difference between those two and convince Christians to get the state to do the church's job. Now, churches have always been the ones, Christians have been the ones that invented universities, built hospitals, built orphanages. Those are things that Christians do really well. But the idea was, well, let's get the state to start doing those things, and the state can subsidize people. And that's the first step. And the way you do that is by reminding Christians, hey, doesn't the Bible say to love your neighbor? My candidate wants to love her neighbor by offering free elective abortions to everybody. That's loving because it's healthcare. Your candidate wants to keep people out of the country. That's hateful. And so you have to love your neighbor. And that alone is enough to get a lot of Christian intellectuals to say, yeah, I guess you're kind of right. That is really hateful. And Jesus told us to love our neighbor and take care of widows and orphans. What Jesus didn't say is do those things through the centralized bureaucracy of a state. He didn't say enlist Rome to do those things. He told Christians in the church to do those things. So that's a very successful strategy that works, just throwing those verses back at Christians.
Yeah, I'd like to just touch on how, and stick on how Marxism is a religious substitute or even a religion or a cult of Christianity. And, that I think in your Mere Marxism article, you talked about how there's a problem of sin in Marxism, but some are born sinners and some are born sinned against. But just, as Jesus provides good news so that you can be set free from sin, the Marxist religion also provides atonement for your sin, which is more theology, more religion, right? If you happen to be born into the class of oppressor, well, there's good news because now you can work hard. You can do the work to redeem yourself. If you a lot of virtue signaling and things like that, but hey, you do enough of it, then you can be redeemed. And so one thing that you said, let me read it here. You said Marxism should rightly be considered as a cult that borrows from Christian beliefs. It teaches about a perfect time, the introduction of sin, private property and greed, and the path through atonement and redemption. It is a religion of works. There is no grace or mercy. You can only be redeemed by doing your fair share. So I think you've done a lot here to show that Marxism is a religion. And so now that you've done that, I'm sure that the ACLU will be consistent and demand the separation of church and state, right?
Well, that's another really important way that this happens is without saying Marxism, the humanities professor can teach all the same things as Marxism in their classroom, and no administrator will ever say, whoa, hey, you're teaching a religion. Of course, if I was to do that with Christianity, they say, now, wait a minute, we're a secular university, keep religion separate.
Right.
And so that's another part of the strategy is to say, this is just social studies. We're looking at inequality in the world. We're not doing religion. And they're able to bring in all of the Marxist beliefs along with that. And that's the other conflict I have right now at ASU. And it's internal to ASU right now. It's not gone to a law court like the first one, but it's about my introduction to Christianity class. I've been teaching this, 24 years, not every semester, but on and off. So I have some expertise. I published internationally on Christianity. I've got books with Cambridge University Press. I don't say that to promote myself, but just to say I can go toe to toe with anyone else at ASU who says I'm an expert in Introduction to
Right.
Christianity.
Mhm.
And we're changing our general ed requirements so that we need to revise our syllabi to show they meet them. That's fine. But I did that for Introduction to Christianity, and you have to submit it to other departments that also teach it. And so one of the other departments sent it back and said, no, you can't use this syllabus because you do things like use the word biblical worldview. You talk about the Old Testament, which implies there's a New Testament that replaced the Old. You talk too much about Western civilization. And I didn't see anything in there about slavery or colonization. Fix that and maybe we'll talk.
Wow.
So the stage is at now is I wrote back in and said, I will make sure that the part we all share doesn't say anything about that because that's your academic freedom and I'll protect that. But the other part on there that's an example of what I teach, I'm not changing that. I'm not going to stop talking about the things you just listed. And I'm not going to add in stuff about slavery. Although I did say this, I will add this in, that Christianity gave the world the first slave-free civilization. So if you want me to talk about slavery, I'll definitely talk about the abolitionists. But as it is right now, that's not a big part of what we go over in Introduction to Christianity.
You know, the first book of the Bible in Genesis, it refers to slavery as evil because it talks about how, hey, what you meant for evil, God used for good. Well, what was that evil? Selling Joseph into slavery against his will. We know that is evil from the first. Selling people into slavery against their will is evil from the first book of the Bible. And then you can make a case on top of that going clear into the New Testament.
But what they do is they'll find, obviously, there were people who said they're Christians and they owned slaves. And they used parts of the Bible, maybe the curse on Ham. They reference those things to justify their slavery, which of course we all agree doesn't justify it. But they'll find those guys and say, see, Christians believe this. And that kind of gets us to the next big problem I bring up in that article, the problem of evil. Marxism is a solution to the problem of evil. Christians have no problem with the fact of saying there were Christians who were sinners. I mean, that's not, wow, like Captain Obvious. But for Marxism, they do, because you have to be pure or you'll be executed. And there's no grace or mercy. There's no actual redemption. There's just works. And it's very ritualistic, I should say. If you've seen the Matt Walsh movie, you'll see how they have these rituals which play the role. They are a substitute for rituals in religion. They're the same thing, though. For example, in my faculty meetings, and the purpose of our faculty meetings is to discuss faculty business, budget, events, class enrollment, which classes we'll offer. But we have to open every single meeting with a Native American land acknowledgement, where we read a statement about Native American tribes that ASU has displaced. And my response to that has always been the same. Words don't mean anything. Sell your home, give the money to any of the tribes you just mentioned.
You first.
It's very easy to tell ASU to do it because you can't have any control over that. But you live on that same land. So they have these rituals that don't actually translate into action. And they're ritualistic in that sense that they're like a religion. Instead of saying the Lord's Prayer, we say this. And instead of having confession of sin, we expect the white guy to say, hey, I recognize my privilege. I'm just going to say that, and I'll sit down and be quiet as penance. And that's what they want you to go through. So it's a religion in that sense, and its solution to the problem of evil is incredibly superficial because it's simply an economic, at best, solution. It's actually been an economic disaster. But the best case scenario, if they got what they wanted, everybody has equal money, or maybe the white guys don't anymore to pay back. But that's the best you've got. What about all the most important things in life, like the meaning of life and being reconciled to God and having friendship? Friendship is not determined by money. You could be a rich person and have no friends. So there's all kinds of a healthy family. Many times rich people have family conflicts. So none of the actual problems that humans face are solved by that economic side of things. So that's why I say it's a very superficial solution to the problem of evil.
Yeah, and we can expect nothing else from a materialistic kind of reductionistic view of the only solutions are going to be superficial. When you were explaining that, it sounded to me almost like, and I've said this before, that there are certain creeds that must be recited,
Yep.
and then certain sacraments that must be performed.
100%.
And I remember when the George Floyd thing happened, and there were a bunch of white people that would go and kneel in front of. This is just basically a sacrament of subservience. It doesn't actually mean anything because you're just going to go back home and go to work the next day. But what you've done is you performed a sacrament. It's a means of redemption, not even a means of grace. It's a means of redemption. As long as you speak up about the right things and keep quiet about the other things, because you can.
And that's actually a really good example too about purgation of sin, because that summer saw cities across the country burning.
Yeah.
And there's been no law enforcement against those persons. I think 24 people died that summer.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea is that, they're purging evil. And so that's okay to do those things. That's part of it's a small picture of what the revolution will be like when it finally happens.
That's right.
All of the structures will be burned down, and a phoenix will arise out of the ashes and establish perfection. Incidentally, the phoenix is another symbol for Lucifer, cast from heaven, crashing into earth, and rising again to rule earth. So
really,
the phoenix will rise again is another way of saying Lucifer will still reign on the earth. I'm not suggesting they're consciously thinking that, but just in terms of religious symbolism, that's what's there. So think about the problem of evil. They have this really superficial answer, but they turn it back on Christians and say, well, if God existed, why would he permit his people to have the transatlantic slave trade? He could have done something about it, and he didn't. And the same thing should be flipped back on them to say, well, wait a minute, your answer is even worse. Now, that doesn't make the Christian answer true. I'm going to defend that as well. But your materialistic answer is even worse, because basically you just had groups of animals fighting each other because we're just animals. And there's no room then for human rights or rule of law.
Right.
You don't see that in nature.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. And it's amazing how pervasive. I wrote an article a few months ago called basically the new cultural Christianity, that progressive Christianity has become the new cultural Christianity, that's kind of the accepted form of Christianity, culturally speaking. But it is mostly this materialistic, reductionistic view of what, like, taking Jesus's words and applying them specifically to only physical situations.
Mm-hmm.
And I think of that in regards to the answer to the problem of evil is to redistribute all of this stuff, but at the same time also to put yourself low because you've been in a position of authority for so long, and to say that is justice when it's the antithesis of what Jesus would have said was what justice would be.
Yeah.
What were you going to say, Tim?
I think that's right. And we don't want to allow the Marxists to paint how we understand past Christians who call themselves progressive, because they were dealing with some very difficult issues. For example, late 18th century immigration to the United States involved serious levels of poverty in big cities like New York and Boston. And so Christians wanted to deal with that as best they could, but they were explicitly Christian in their solutions, and they offered Christian solutions about those things. What happened in the 20th century was it increasingly got secularized, where Marxism can step in and take credit for that. So we don't want to allow that kind of Marxist re-explanation of what happened in the past. We have to look at those past situations individually and see what was going on. But I do think that, unfortunately, the progressive Christians began to think that the Great Commission, the fulfillment of the Great Commission, comes about mostly in terms of physical changes in the world. Poverty's gone. All the orphans and widows have state subsidy. And they weren't thinking anymore of the gospel, which transforms lives. And one of the battles we're seeing now, I think that Megan Basham's new book deals with this, is ways that evangelicals are increasingly becoming the progressives that Machen wrote about in Christianity and liberalism.
Yeah. 100% agree. And I've seen that quite a bit lately. And speaking up against that. But one thing that the left often said, and you often hear that a certain political candidate on the right wants to be a dictator on day one, but on the left, if they want this forced equity, really, well, doesn't that require dictatorship?
Yeah,
or at least something similar. I mean, it's
you'll have some kind of
huge government.
totalitarian state.
Yeah,
maybe they think a dictator means just one person, but
Right.
I'm not sure the other side is offering anything different. But yeah, that's a good example of how people in this political conflict work. That's one thing I've been studying up close, Trump derangement syndrome,
right.
because Trump has I think, hilarious sense of humor. And he's perhaps the best at trolling that we've ever seen. And so when he says certain things like, "Oh yeah, I'll be a dictator for one day," that's taken in the most serious sense possible.
Yes.
That he's literally going to change the Constitution.
No hermeneutical principles applied. What drives me crazy is when I'm talking to other Christian philosophers and theologians who have been trained in hermeneutics but refuse to apply what they've learned to Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Well,
and then just the claim about the was it Charlottesville parade?
Yes.
He said there was, and then they cut the clip. Because if you keep playing it, he says, "Well, I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis, of course. They're despicable." But the first half of that has been used over and over and over to manipulate. So that's a whole different and fascinating problem. Man, this is I remember leftist professors hating George W. Bush, but now, and specifically, the person they hated the most was Dick Cheney.
Yeah,
because they argue that Halliburton, which Dick Cheney had been associated with before he was vice president, was just making money off the Iraq war.
Right.
Now they're going to be best friends with Dick Cheney. They miss George W. Bush because they hate Donald Trump so much. And I think the only factor that I can explain is the Christian factor. It's to them a terrifying brand of Christianity. And I'm not real, if I was to give Trump advice, I'm not presuming to do so. Hey, get into a Bible believing church. I'd love to see you worshiping God every Sunday.
Amen.
Not a huge fan of some of the was it name it and claim it stuff that might be in those settings. But so he needs to go to church. He needs to worship God. But the things that he's arguing for tend to be things that are conservative evangelical causes.
Yeah.
And that terrifies the other side. I think that's what it is. That's what worries them.
And I think he's the one that's willing to just say it plainly. And it's interesting to me to see, like, it's this redefinition of reality that actually has to exist, because it happens with the trans idea too, where reality has to be bent to my physical desires. That because I mentally think that I am this way, I need to bend reality and the physical nature of reality this way. But it also happens with ideas. Like recently, Trump said that he would abolish the Department of Education. And I make the point that what good fascist dictator would abolish the federal Department of Education? It's literally could you imagine Hitler saying, "No, I don't want to control the education in Germany"? It's literally part of the fascist platform to control the education. And yet here we are.
That's where we're at right now, is that parents are told, you can't homeschool your kids. You don't know enough to do that. You have to send them to state-run schools. And again, public education in the United States began in an understandable context, which was you have influxes of people who don't have access to education, and their parents can't provide it because of the working conditions. And so churches coupled with the state to provide public education. The main thing that they wanted to do was teach children to read and write. And why do you want them to learn to read? Well, you want to learn to read the most important thing there is. You're not just learning to read Marvel comics. You're learning to read the very word of God.
That's right.
And so literacy rates shot through the roof. Yeah, I shouldn't say that, huh? I'm not insulting Marvel comics. Literacy rates shot through the roof in the United States because children are taught how to read. But then what happens is, as we get into the 20th century, especially the second half of the 20th century, all of the public school teachers are getting their degrees from secular universities where the professors are advocating this new cultural Marxism, post-World War II cultural Marxism, and then bringing that back into the classrooms. And parents aren't aware of this. And so in some ways, it's done somewhat secretively. It's not as if they say, I follow Herbert Marcuse.
Right.
They just have been shaped by those thoughts. And so now we have a very objectionable situation where we're not teaching children to learn to read the Bible. We're teaching them the Bible ignored.
Yeah, and if you look at old curriculum from the late 1800s, it's all, that's how you learn your alphabet, is to learn Bible. It's all based in scripture. And one of the things I've said is probably the most effective argument that the left made to the common populace is that the separation of church and state, which is not in the Constitution, but is, it's supposedly contained in the First Amendment.
Yeah.
The separation of church and state, the best lie that they were able to sell was that it was supposed to protect the state from the church, which is exactly the opposite of what it was supposed to do. It was supposed to protect the church from the state. And so now we have all these people that when you go, oh, we're going to put the 10 Commandments up in school in Louisiana, and they go, oh, it's a separation of church and state. Be like, that's not even the intent of the entire thing. If you read the letter to the Danbury Baptist,
the phrase separation of church and state comes from a Jefferson letter to the Danbury Baptist Church. The Baptists are worried about that. They've had a long history of persecution by, for example, the Church of England. And so they want to make sure, is that going to happen again? And he says, no. In other words, you'll be protected. So that just goes to your whole point, is that the very letter that says separation of church and state is about protecting Christian denominations that don't believe in a state church.
Yeah. And even up to, I think, the middle 1800s, there were individual states in the Union that still had state churches.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's something that's pointed out, is sometimes Christians will say the Constitution is godless because it doesn't specifically mention God or Jesus. Even the Declaration says God. But the Constitution didn't need to, because all 13 colonies, as they became states, their constitutions did that. And most of them had a faith requirement to hold public office. They were very specific. So the beginning, when people say, well, is the Constitution Christian or not? They have these long debates. Really, what you should do is lower that to the state level and look at the state constitutions. And then the answer is a resounding yes.
Absolutely. So what do we...
the other thing that we should talk about, I mentioned the whiteness training, but I also have heteronormativity training. And so we have a whole employee training at ASU called Safe Zone. And what you do in Safe Zone training is you learn that there are an infinite number of genders. And anybody who disagrees with that is a homophobe. And you need to identify homophobes and report them. And homophobes do things like teach that God made man male and female. And so once you go through the training, you take a little quiz, and if you pass it, you get a rainbow sticker to put on your door of your office. And that means that you're a safe professor. Now, this has all kinds, this is all kinds of problems with this. Every ASU employee is a state employee. We all agreed when we got hired to obey the laws of the state of Arizona and the United States government. And that means we agreed to not discriminate on politics, religion, race, ethnicity, gender, all those things. So I'm already safe. It's insulting to suggest I'm not safe until I get this sticker. It implies there's two kinds of professors: the safe ones with the sticker and the unsafe ones without the sticker.
Yeah, and it's really kind of Orwellian in a sense, because to me, what that says is, as I zoom out 30,000 foot view and put my tinfoil hat on, and maybe it's not even tinfoil anymore. Maybe it's just an actual hat because our culture's gone so crazy. But what it seems to me is that sort of training is actually training people to inform on fellow citizens if they break with the states. And we saw it with COVID, right? I mean, Tim Walz, the vice presidential candidate, had a hotline to do COVID reporting. And so when we learn of history and we go, can you believe people in Nazi Germany ratted out neighbors who were Nazis, or communists were ratting out their neighbors because they were holding Bible studies? and they go, that would never happen in the United States. To me, these sorts of trainings for the next generation are actually training grounds so that that sort of thing can be implemented.
Yeah.
Yep.
Is that me being conspiratorial, or does that logic flow?
Well, the logic flows in the sense of answering, how could those people have done that?
Mm.
Well, you're seeing how you get walked right into that same situation. And of course, they'll say, yeah, but we don't have concentration camps. But
Yeah.
what you're doing is you're reporting to the government about biblical beliefs as being problematic.
Mhm.
Same thing. If it'll get to the level, a worse level with the next generation, in one way we say wait and see, but another way we don't want to be naive and not think that there are mechanisms in place to contain and control Christianity. And that's what falls on the three of us in our day to stand up and say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to oppose that. Because if we simply have a go along to get along mentality, we don't want to cause any waves, then that could happen. It is possible that happens. And I think that the way we get there is by having lost the gospel. The gospel becomes a social gospel. And the social gospel is all about material things, no longer about the spiritual truth that you're alienated from God, your creator. In fact, when you read Marx, he goes over 5 kinds of alienation, like alienation from your labor, alienation from other humans, alienation from the means of production, alienation from yourself as a human. He never goes over the one the Apostle Paul tells us about. You're alienated from God.
Yeah.
And if you had to pick, I'd want to solve that one
Right.
before I'm worried about my paycheck.
Yeah.
I'd want to solve, how do I know to be reconciled to God? But the social gospel, the progressive gospel, which now just becomes purely secular Marxism, no gospel at all, is that economic salvation. And it's a very empty message. And it's on Christians to stand up and say, that's not the truth. This is the truth.
Mm. Nice.
That's good. How do we do this? I guess we kind of drill down.
Yep.
We want to do it in a winsome way, but we don't want to do it in as somebody who kind of raises their hand and then puts it down after getting shouted at, right? So we want to win people, but we don't want to become weak in doing so. What is the balance? You're fighting this at the university level. You're kind of on the front lines as far as that goes. How have you kind of navigated that? That might help some of us and the listeners kind of apply it in our own work settings, because work is a lot of times just as bad as the state university right now.
I get emails from people who say, hey, thanks for what you're doing. I'm in the private sector and we have to go through DEI training also. And now, unfortunately, the private sector can do that. The private sector can require you to take whatever training they want. They're paying for your time. So you got to sit there and listen to it. They can't compel you to speak or believe things. That's crossing a limit. But if they want to pay you to sit for 4 hours of your workday and watch videos, they have a lot more freedom than the state does because of our First Amendment. The First Amendment applies to the state. And so ASU can't do that.
Can the private sector, can I ask you this? Can the private sector make you watch videos and then tell you have to pass a test?
That's where they could be crossing the line. That's compelled speech.
Okay.
So if they say there's 2 answers, Christians are homophobes, true or false, and you got to put true, they can't make you do that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But that's another thing ASU got in trouble with. And that objection from Goldwater Institute representing me to their quizzes, they took down their quizzes because that's a clear violation. They haven't taken down the training yet.
Wow.
But it does depend on your setting. So I'm working with people who say, sometimes explicitly, otherwise through their lives, that they hate Christ. And so I need to be pretty direct about that. I'm a lot less worried about being winsome in that setting because I'm thinking about all the people that they're affecting. But I don't know that translates to, for example, Thanksgiving lunch with extended family, right? We say, all right, I just have to let Uncle Bob know, here's the truth of the matter. So I think that the first thing to do is know the Word of God. And I especially recommend Romans chapter 1. Because Romans chapter 1 perfectly charts our culture right now.
Yeah.
It starts with the fact that it is clear that God exists, so that unbelief is without excuse, but that humans turn from that to idolatry. And then it leads to all other kinds of sins, which we're seeing manifest in our culture. So know Romans 1 really well.
Amen.
And know what Christianity is taught. I used the phrase earlier, Orthodox Christianity with a small o. Know what does Christianity teach, and why are other views opposed to it? And then know those other views, because then you'll be able to say, okay, this is what we're going to expect. I just recorded a video about the 10 challenges Christians will face with Frank Turek. And he made the point, well, these are really what anybody in our culture is going to face. And I think that that's right. You need to know what is not only cultural Marxism, but what does the LGBTQ movement teach? And what is it to be an activist? Because many of the degrees at ASU, the humanities degrees, on their webpage, they'll give a list of jobs that you can get when you get this degree. And the first one on the list is activist or advocate. What are those? And so you need to know what that is, because that might sound kind of good at first. It's not good. And so you know what the opposition is doing, and then you can tailor that to your given setting.
That's good. That's good. And when you say know the Bible, one of the things that I've told people too is allow the Bible to define your terms too, like love, truth, respect, gentleness. Because what I've found is in our culture, we'll use the progressive movement will use those terms and twist it to, especially the word love, to equal this affirmation style love that is found actually nowhere in Scripture. But to say, well, that doesn't feel loving. One of the things, one of the things I've told people are the two main values of our culture right now are to feel important and feel loved. Not to be important or be loved. Those are different things. It's to feel. It's subjective. And if you don't let me feel that way, then you're not loving me in my truth and in my lived experience. And so we need to let the Bible define those terms.
Yeah, that's right. Love and justice, I argue, are the two biggest redefined terms. And you're spot on about what love is. It's a feeling of being affirmed, but you would not want a medical doctor who operates on that principle. You come in, you're smoking, 300 pounds overweight, no cardio in your life, and eat a Big Mac, and he says, hey, you're doing great. I want you to keep doing what you're doing. You're a special person. I love it. You want a doctor who says, we got to start over here, pal. You're not healthy at all. First, put the cigarette out. So loving someone doesn't just mean telling them what they want to hear. It means telling them the truth.
That's right.
And I recognize that. People can be jerks about the truth. Don't be a jerk about the truth. But the flip side of that is not good either, to be a coward about the truth.
Well, and we make the doctor comparison, and that's kind of feels like a humorous comparison, but that's actually the direction medicine is going in our country. I mean, you see we can't, fat phobic doc. Like, I don't go to my doctor because he's fat phobic.
I don't think I'm even allowed to say 300 pounds overweight, because that implies there's a good weight. Or I mean, you just even look at the transgender ideology to say we can't call a surgery on a minor what it is. A butchery of this is no longer first do no harm. It's do physical harm so that you can get paid and so that you can affirm somebody's subjective self-belief. And so we use the example of a doctor. No one would want that. We think no one would want that, but there are people now in our culture that not only want that, they're advocating for it. And that's why it's so important to do what you're doing. When I saw a great presentation by a psychologist who had been at Johns Hopkins when they introduced trans surgeries decades ago. And Johns Hopkins, I think, led the way on that, and then also led the way on stopping them because of this psychologist's work. And the point he made was that psychology and psychiatry, their job has been, up until now, to get your mind to integrate with reality. So if you come in and you say, I'm Napoleon, the job of the psychologist is to say, hey, just so you know, you're not actually Napoleon. You're Owen Anderson, and let's figure out what's going on that you think you're Napoleon. But now the psychologist would say, you're 100% right. Let's go down to the costume store. I'm going to help you pick out a great Napoleon outfit. And I want people to call you the emperor as you walk around.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that has devastating ramifications for. We talk about the mental health crisis in our culture, and people point to social media, and I think that's a big part of it. But I think the bigger part of it is this: we are not actually built as human beings to live life only being affirmed all of the
Yeah.
time.
Well, that's what we're
Because
going to wait and see. The developmental problems that come up, it'll be about 5-10 years. They're starting to hit now, but they're going to hit 5-10 years real hard. I think you're going to see massive lawsuits by
Yeah.
children who went through this, maybe against their own parents, but also against these doctors for malpractice. And that's going to be very serious in the business, because that's one of the ways that when law fails you, malpractice lawyers can help you by suing industries that cause great harm.
Yeah. Hope
Absolutely.
that happens. Can't happen soon enough.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, because I've been in faculty meetings where professors talk openly about how they like to deconstruct the faith of young Christians, and so we know for a long time we've known Christian parents are worried about going to state university because your child will deconvert. But that's something about children. That's not unique to Christians. Children raised this way are also going to rebel, and their rebellion might be become a conservative Christian. But they're going to grow up and say, what on earth did my parents are crazy? What did they do to me?
Right.
Just like the Christian kids do the same thing, because that's what kids do.
Anecdotally, I think I've seen some of that already starting to happen. With some of my son's friends who weren't raised Christian but are now seeing conservative Christianity is quite attractive. I've got a couple questions for you. First, what does ASU do with you? What does Arizona State University do with you? Do you feel like do they encourage you to keep pushing back against them, or do they try to silence you? What is that like there? Answer that and I'll ask the next question.
Well, ASU is the largest state university in the country.
Is it really?
We have something like 185,000 students. So it's huge. It's got tons of departments. It's got 4 main campuses, and each campus is huge, obviously. It's spread across the greater Phoenix area, which is a massive area. From one side to the other is 100 miles. So it's huge. And that's because we pursued a different model than the Cal State model, where you have smaller universities spread throughout the state. We only have 3 universities. And so ASU's taken this path of growing. So I just say that to say there's thousands of professors, and you can get lost very easily. ASU has a lot of high profile stuff. In the 90s, ASU was #1 for partying. It'd be ASU and UCSB. And I can't imagine how ASU would ever beat Santa Barbara. It's just perfect place. But they're competing for #1 for partying. But now we have some legitimate claims for scholarship. And I'm not saying we didn't back then. I'm not insulting any professors, but just that if you knew of ASU at all, you knew of them because that's a party school. Yeah. And now we've got some good claims. And so the university focuses on those things. They'll protect my academic freedom, but I know I'm also being closely watched. I can see who looks at my Substack and at my Facebook videos. And I had a vice provost. So the provost is the one who's in charge of all the faculty. So a vice provost who works in an office assigned to me watching all my stuff. Wow. So I know that does not happen with every faculty member. It's just the conservative guy speaking up. So if I take any misstep,
we'll wave to them right now.
Yeah.
Hi, Vice Provost.
So I know if I make any misstep. Now, my message is about academic freedom and about discrimination against Christians. I'm trying to that's what my message is.
That's your lane.
I want to teach Christianity faithfully. I don't want to get pulled onto other things that they might want me to debate because they'll say, oh, see, that's a Christian nationalist. I'm staying on this message, this topic. And what I've been doing on my Substack is documenting events and employee training that ASU has. One of my favorites from a couple of years ago was a pro-witchcraft event at the Honors College. 3 weeks ago, we had a pro-polyamory event at ASU. Well, you'll never see a pro-biblical marriage event, pro-polyamory. And then about that same time, 3 weeks ago, there was an ASU event with 2 ASU professors speaking to ASU students. And the one of the professors said in that event, if you don't vote for Kamala Harris, you'll be imprisoned and forced to breed.
Oh my goodness.
Now, the best I can think is that this person misunderstood A Handmaid's Tale. They thought it was a documentary, not fiction. But this is as its employee. So ASU defended that as academic freedom. And I pushed back and said, no, academic freedom means I can speak in my private life. I can study what I want, but state law and our ASU faculty manual both explicitly limit what we can say as state employees. And that's a perfect example of what you cannot say. It prohibits us from trying to influence how students vote with our own personal political opinions. So that's not protected. So we'll see how this stuff pans out. I know I'm marked. I know I'm carefully monitored for any misstep, but at the same time, I'm not going to stop talking about these things. And I on my Substack, I switched to a new phase now where I'm imitating Martin Luther. I'm not going to go to 95, but I'm going through theses that I will debate any ASU professor or administrator on publicly. Just tell me when and where, I'll be there. And so I've got to number 2 so far about what ASU isn't doing. And I'm going to keep going on those to have a record, to say I would have debated these with anybody. No one took me up on it.
Yeah.
That's good.
Nice.
ASU, that's where Lawrence Krauss.
He was. He was
right?
fired for sexual impropriety.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I couldn't remember what.
That was a big. He had the best office, highest paid,
really,
clearly a star, and he got in trouble on his own accord. So.
Yeah, I just remember his.
I think his argument was that the trouble came into existence from nothing. That's how he defended himself.
But nothing isn't really nothing to Lawrence Krauss.
right.
I remember his debate against, I think it was William Lane Craig, was one of the most unhinged debates I've ever seen.
Oh yeah,
really,
that was it. Yeah, well, he did one where he actually ripped his shirt open and it said 2 + 2 = 5, and then they had 2 or 3 other moderated debates. I believe Graham Oppie was the moderator in Australia, and that's where Krauss just lost it. And he had this beeper, and every time Dr. Craig would try to talk, he's like, me. I'm like, oh, what is this? It's not an academic debate.
He's so childish.
Man.
Yeah, there's been some guys that interact with William Lane Craig respectfully and try to have legitimate arguments, but there's a few like that. The very first William Lane Craig debate I saw, I was still in high school, and it was at ASU. And my dad took me to it because he was trying to encourage me in Christian philosophy. Nice. And it definitely changed my whole trajectory. I saw that and I was like, that is what I want to do. William Craig was so professional. He gave these arguments. But the ASU professor, who was the head of the atheist student group, he's kind of well known as an atheist. He was terrible. He gave a slideshow. This is literally back when you had slides that would go chunk, chunk, to date me. And they were each just like basically his pre-meme, but it was just a slideshow of anti-Christian memes. And then so William Lane Craig gave his standard 5 things. Then this guy, Dr. Dietz, gave his slideshow. And then William Lane Craig said, hey, I asked these 5 things. Does he respond to any of them? Let's go into some more detail. And then please respond. And then it would be Dr. Dietz's turn, slideshow. So it was really bad showing for the atheists, but that will always be in my memory because it was the first time I saw William Lane Craig and saw the powerful ability to argue for Christian beliefs.
Yeah. Well, my last question for you, and Josh, feel free to ask more after this, but I interact with quite a few college professors at the local university here in Nebraska and elsewhere. But what would you say to them? What would you say to these other Christian professors who they don't feel as comfortable being as outspoken as you are? How would you encourage them, and just what would you say to them in general?
Well, it's true. I want to be sensitive to the fact that the way that it works as a professor, we use that term to mean anybody who teaches at a university, but that's not technically correct. So you might have different people. You might have somebody who's on a 1 semester by semester contract, and that's usually called an adjunct. And so the university has no obligation to hire them ever again. If you teach in the fall, it does not create an obligation for you to teach in the spring. And so I know a professor at ASU West, he was an adjunct, and he, in his ethics class, just brought up the debate about homosexuality. Is it a sin or not? And bringing that up was enough that he never got renewed again. So that's one level. Then the level I'm at is called tenure track, which means tenure means that after about 7 years, you can apply for tenure. And if you get that, you have it for life, meaning that you can pursue your research. It's a research idea. You can pursue your research because you've proven that you've got a good research topic, and it prevents you from getting fired or harassed for ideological reasons, which would be very easy in the university to do. And so that's the next level of research. And then the final level, after about 14 or 15 years, is called full professor. That's when you're actually a professor in a research university. And so if someone's pre-tenure, I can understand. I'm not suggesting that they should be outspoken, because you probably won't get tenure if you speak up, and that's illegal. But there's all kinds of ways to hide that. Yeah, no one's going to write down on the list, he's an outspoken conservative Christian, don't give him tenure. They'll find some other way to do that. So I understand that. But for me, it was when I became full professor, there seemed to be this correlation. It had always been bad, but something around when Obama was elected changed on campuses, and it got more bold and more anti-Christian. Yeah. And so those things kind of corresponded. I said, I'm a full professor now, and the rhetoric is amped up, and it only got worse with Trump. And so, yeah, if I don't speak up now, when will I? And it does have, I mean, I could still face consequences. I'm not safe. Like I said, I know I'm being watched. I know I could be let go. But the other side of it is, well, good, I kept my job, but I never said anything.
Right. You know, I've recently lost, and Josh and I have both lost thousands of dollars per year already because of our stand. There's some churches who don't like what we're saying, and they were previously supporting us financially, and now they're not. And was asked to be quiet on these. They said, you're getting too political. And I said, we're staying in our lane of theology, and when politics swerves into our lane, we're going to run it over. But I'm not leaving my lane of theology. I'm staying here. I'm going to pursue sound theology. And when, I also like to describe it as north and south objective morality. Any Christian leader should be focused on objective north and south objective morality. And when right and left politics gets caught in the crossfire, I say, so be it. Yeah. But, one thing I've said is, take your thousands of dollars a year. I will work at McDonald's before I sacrifice truth. Yeah. And I think, I think you and I are, and Josh, we're all cut out of that same cloth. Yeah. I can't be quiet. I don't want to keep my job just because I refrain from speaking the truth. I won't do that.
Yeah. You can imagine there's a conflict, violent clash. And when it's over, one of the guys on your side walks up and says, oh man, that was intense. I didn't get punched one time. You say, wow, how do you dodge punches? Well, see that tree over there, I just hid behind that tree the whole time and I didn't get punched at all. Yeah. It's sort of like, well, that's not really good though, right? No. So sometimes you're going to get punched, and it's not any fun at all. And I'm speaking spiritually here for anyone listening. I'm not talking about physically punching anybody. Yeah. Just the spiritual metaphor of a spiritual battle. Yeah. Sometimes it's gonna be uncomfortable. Like my faculty meetings, there's my school, which is about 60 of us. Then there's my college, which is about 300 of us. Pretty uncomfortable in the social setting, right? Because it's just me. Yeah. There's no one else. I know other Christians at ASU, but they're not in my department. So yeah, that's not really a very high price to pay. I think I saw a meme one time of Jim Caviezel during this filming, where he's dressed up, for that crucifixion scene. Yeah. And Mel Gibson is in normal clothes as a director explaining something to Jim Caviezel. And the meme just says, me explaining my problems to Christ. Yeah. Right. And it's like, I mean, hey, I was uncomfortable in a meeting. Yeah. Paul got beaten and thrown in prison.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's good to have that eternal perspective of, when I stand before God, will I say, hey, I provided for my family, But then I kind of didn't do what I was called to do when crunch time came. And in the positions that we're in, all three of us, we actually have jobs and positions where it is our duty to say things. Like it is, perhaps the guy who's working as a plumber, the best thing he can do is be a faithful plumber, go to his church, go to Bible study. Maybe he doesn't need to be active on Facebook, that sort of thing. But the things that we're doing, the things that I'm doing, I said to someone on Twitter the other day, if they someday make Christianity illegal and use social media as a way to figure out who are the most outspoken ones, I'll be pretty high on the list.
Yeah. Right.
And I'm okay with that. And I've had to tell my son, even he's 13, I've said, hey, I just need you to know, Christ is my first allegiance. And I would not parent you well if I would let go of that allegiance, the allegiance to truth and Jesus, to keep you physically or emotionally safe. Like I want you to be spiritually safe. So
I think that's right. And also I would encourage people though, social media is great, a great invention, but also get to know real people and present the gospel to them.
Yes.
Because there's different kinds of Facebook engagements. Like the stuff we all do is more ministry focused, but then there's just wanting to argue on Facebook. I think that's another meme I liked of a guy. He's at his computer, and in the background, his wife says, "Time for dinner," and he says, "Just a minute, someone's wrong on the internet." I was like, "Yeah, that could do that for everybody."
I think I'm guilty. My wife will tell you I'm guilty. I'm that guy.
Yeah,
or I have.
Yeah, but so the guy at work, who his job's not to teach anybody. He just works at a software company, but get to know your coworkers and see what cares they have in life, not as a way to manipulate them, but just get to know them as human beings and see what's their life like.
Yeah. So I think it's a battle on so many fronts, right? So it's like there needs to be people on the battle on the cultural front. You have to. But that carries no weight if there's not people within the culture, personal relationships, sharing the gospel, people coming to faith, and then churches unapologetically preaching the gospel and the truth of God's word.
One Christian speaker said something that stood out to me. He said, it's related to what I said earlier about Jim Caviezel and Mel Gibson. And he said, in one way, that's true for us. We're not right now facing imprisonment the way Paul and Silas did. But he said, we shouldn't minimize what we do face, because in the Roman Empire, they never went after your job. Like Paul was allowed to make tents wherever he went. But in the United States, people face losing their job, which is a real threat, especially if you got a family and kids. And so we also don't want to minimize the fact that, speaking up could be scary. I lose my job. How do I feed my children? That's a real problem. And in one way, it's interesting. Paul didn't face that.
Yeah.
Right. True.
Well, that's so true. And I think that's also why it's important that things like Matt Walsh's mockumentary exist to help rein back some of that. I saw it at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln recently, because I'm from Nebraska, recently eliminated their diversity and equity and inclusion department. And I saw all sorts of hand-wringing on, Twitter and stuff like, oh, how could they do this? And my response was, praise the Lord, praise the Lord that people had. And I think part of it was, hey, we were promised if we instituted this program, we'd have better student life. We'd have more unity and our enrollment would go up.
It's been a complete failure.
Yeah. All three of those things have failed. Our student life is horrible. Our enrollment's gone down and the student unity is worse than it's ever been. And they're like, actually, we have to eliminate this.
Well, so, ASU made the Matt Walsh movie because we had an event maybe 4 years ago where two white guys were studying in an area and some African-American students decided this was a safe zone for them. And so they approached those two guys and tried to kick them out, and all of it got filmed. And our president came down against those students and said, no, ASU students can study wherever they want. But that made the Matt Walsh video because did they interview? I think he interviewed one of those students. She's like a PhD in sustainability or something. And at ASU. So I think it's good for people to know how universities work. So when they say they eliminated DEI, okay, that's great. But I guarantee you they'll shift the funds to a new program called EID, which is about inclusion, equity, and diversity, right? So it's not as if they said, hey, I'm going to start going to church. I believe in Christ now. Humans are equal. They still have the same beliefs, so they're just going to shuffle it around. So we have to do more than just that. And the things you mentioned are so true. It's been a complete failure. And universities, secular universities are huge sinkholes of money because we're administration heavy. We don't need DEI departments. We need professors and facilities. But instead we have all of these social programs and those have to have more deans. There's hundreds of deans and all of them have assistants. And so if someone was fiscally responsible and just came in and said, I just want to clear this up, they could do a lot of cutting and save a ton of money. And the university would still do what it's supposed to do, which is teach students. Yeah.
And then eliminate a lot of absolutely useless degrees that, like that girl in the Matt Walsh documentary, she got a PhD in whatever it was. It's like, and then you hear her talk with Matt Walsh and you go, this is just proof that there are certain PhD tracks and programs that are worthless and should never even exist. So
that ASU just this semester came out and said every student at ASU before for the 4-year degree, bachelor's degree, has to take a sustainability class. That's their one thing, and that's what ASU wants to be known for. Now, think about that. You don't need a class on wisdom. You don't need a class on logic. You need a class on sustainability. And that's where we're at right now. And that's a good example. But of course, it always makes people nervous, Josh, when you start to say useless degrees, because pretty much everyone's mind goes to philosophy. The worst thing you can hear as a parent is your child comes home and says, hey, Dad, I think I want to become a philosophy major. And I know for the three of us, we want to, But for the normal parent, they're like, no, there's no philosophy factory. Where are you going to work? So that's what academic freedom protects. But at the same time, in my school, our gender studies program has 0 new majors this year. So that is part of how you determine it. And a lot of the degrees we're talking about are brand new topics. Like they've been around for 30 years. No one doubts that philosophy started the whole university, the academy, and has been there all throughout the whole time. But these other ones, they're 30 years old at most, and they've got 0 or 2 majors. And how much money are they taking? And that same topic is taught in other areas, but without the ideology.
Yep. Wow. All right. Thank you, Owen, for joining us.
It's been great.
Where can people find your stuff? You mentioned your Substack. Are there other places?
Yeah, I try to stay consistent across social media with Dr. Owen Anderson. So on Twitter, it's Dr._Owen Anderson. Substack's Dr. Owen Anderson. My webpage is drowenanderson.com. And so you'll see me, and same with Facebook, Dr. Owen Anderson. So you'll see me there. And I try my Facebook and my Twitter, Twitter and Substack are my 2 most active places.
Okay.
Awesome. And you have a few things on Clear Truth Media that I've seen as well.
I've been doing a lot with Clear Truth Media and American Reformer articles about cultural conflicts.
Yeah, and your most recent thing that you sent me anyway is the red tape letters.
Yeah.
I assume this is in the style of the screw tape letters. That's what it seemed to me to be.
Yeah, 100%. So I'm going to be doing these sort of as a series. We published the first one last week on Clear Truth Media. So just look for red tape. So red tape is a communist mentoring a secular professor named Professor Holloway about how to deconstruct the faith of a young Christian.
Wow.
So it's using that exact model, except for it's updated to what we're going through. And this is just a human, so he won't have some of the, so to speak, supernatural knowledge that Screw Tape had, but he'll still appear very, very demonic.
Nice.
Yeah, it's really good. I went and read it today when you sent it to us. When you sent it to me, it's really good. Sounds a lot like Screw Tape letters, so you kind of captured that voice well. And obviously, red is in reference to red communism.
Yep. Red tape for communism, but also red tape is what bureaucracies give you. They're actually horrible to deal with. No one wants a big bureaucracy except for the communists.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Hey,
go find those things. Yep. Go ahead, Tim.
You going to be at EPS this year?
I hope so. Yep. I got to wait
Right.
for funding
Ah,
for my school. So we got to see if they do professional development funding or not.
okay. Well, I hope you get there. Josh and I will be there. So
Good.
if you make it, let's make sure to, well,
Yeah.
I'll buy you dinner. How's that?
Yeah, we'll do that. And
Okay.
I want to set up an EPS rolling session because Peter Sedekase is really good. Wait, Parker. Sorry, Parker.
Yeah,
Peter
Parker,
Parker.
Peter.
Parker Sedekase. I know he'll destroy me, but also he pointed this out. Yeah, but I don't have any bragging rights. You're old. So it's a win-win no matter what. Like if I happen to tap him, yeah, it's a win. But if he taps me, I still going to say, yeah, some young guy who's really strong tap me. What's the big deal?
Hey, well, I'm in, and you guys
Yeah.
can both beat me up because I'm older than all you guys. So,
All right.
and
Well,
smaller. I'm older and smaller, so I have no shot. So, but
I'm not in because all I have is high school wrestling and a little bit of grappling. That's it. You
All right.
you can all
Yeah,
beat
it's all
me
for
up.
fun though, anyway.
You guys could
Right.
lead one. You guys, we could all do this. We could give training sessions for people. You know, so there's no.
Well, I
no
think
risk.
there's a lot of analogies that maybe you and I can work on this even because I know you do a lot also of. I think I just saw you're helping train the SWAT team. There's a lot of overlap with physical engagement and philosophical engagement. Both of those can kind of give lessons to each other. So, for example, like we've already talked about, being willing to be in conflict when necessary. Sometimes you can't. The first rule that the Gracie teaches: don't fight.
That's right.
Even if they're in your face, just leave.
Yeah.
But if for some reason you can't, and the example they always give is your family is being threatened, then you gotta stop.
That's right. That's
awesome.
So it drives me. Yep.
Yeah, I saw a documentary on the Gracies, I think,
Sure.
a few years ago.
They're the
Really
best.
fascinating. I wish I would have.
Yep.
I wish I could remember what it was, but
Yeah.
made me want to get into it, but then I never did. Well, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
It's been a good conversation. Hopefully, our audience has found this helpful. Find Dr. Owen Anderson's stuff in all the places that you mentioned and in the description we got here. And as we always say at FreeThinking Ministries, stay reasonable.
All right.